So I'm sure, as you guys know, the number 2 fear of all people is death. The number 1 fear is what I'm doing right now, standing up in front of you. So thank you for helping me overcome my fear. So what I wanted to do was talk a little bit more about the development of the brain for teenagers and what's going on for them, because it is quite interesting, quite impressive, and quite different. A lot of times we look at youth and we think they're mini adults. You know, a 15-year-old is as tall as an adult, they talk like an adult, they sometimes walk like an adult, and yet their brain is not anywhere near that adult stage of development. As I was going through all of my readings and research and looking more at the brain and what it does during those teenage years, I just kept coming up with the portion in Psalms. The psalmist talks about how we're fearfully and wonderfully made. It's just incredible as you look at some of the things that are going on in the body, really specifically and in depth, to see how amazing God is. And I remember when I was doing a biology class in my undergrad, the professor was talking about a Krebs cycle. I don't even remember what that is, but it's some kind of a cycle where there's all these different chemical reactions happening, and it's one small piece in a small part of the cell that's occurring over and over and over all day long. And right in the middle of the lecture, he stopped and he said, "How can anybody not believe that there's a God? How can you look at these small little things, this Krebs cycle, and say, well, that just happened by chance?" It's incredible. So when we look at the brain, it's the same thing. There's 200 billion cells just in the frontal cortex, the main part where we do our rational thinking. In those 200 billion cells, each of the cells are combined in various different ways. There's over, the number is 1 billion trillion connections in your brain alone. I don't really know how many zeros that is, but I'm sure it's a lot. It's just incredible. So there's all these changes that are occurring from about the age of 10 until full maturation at around the age of 25. Some researchers even say not even until the age of 30. And much more research is talking about teenage years as lasting from 10 until 25. So anybody who has younger kids in their house, I'm sorry, it's going to continue until they're 25. All the things that are occurring and that changes in the brain are changes that will occur and are long-lasting. They're permanent. I love the analogy of baking a cake. I don't particularly bake cakes myself. I like eating them. But I know that to be a great baker, you need to be able to put things in the perfect proportion every time. If you're making a cake and you put in 2 extra cups of flour, it's probably not going to be a very tasty cake. If you don't put any eggs in, it probably won't be a very tasty cake. The brain is the same. When it's maturing and going through all those different processes, if you add in a couple of extra things, for example, a teen that drinks all the time, their brain will develop in a very different way. Certain areas will not develop, and it will be like that for the rest of their life. So as a teenager, it's very important to not smoke and not drink. I mean, you can get into that as you're older, and it won't have the same damage to the brain. So when teens come and tell me, I went binge drinking last night, I'm just thinking, oh, your poor brain, it's never gonna, it won't get better. That's as good as it's gonna get. During the teenage years, all of those cells, all those neurons are forming new connections, and they continue to form all those new connections until about the age of 15. At the age of 15, there's still new ones being formed, but ones that are not being used start to get pruned. The brain is like kind of like downtown Toronto. If there's any real estate available, it will be used up very quickly. Even if something's a little bit old, they'll smash it and build a high-rise. Nothing is wasted in the brain. And so when we're talking with our teens about spirituality, it's really important that that's something that we continue to have conversation with, because if it's something that we neglect through those teen years, how can we expect them, when their brain is fully developed at the age of 25, then to go back and pick up the slack from all those years before? All those neurons have already been pruned, and once they're pruned, they're gone. Adults like myself, I have as many brain cells as I'm ever going to have, and any ones that get pruned are lost forever. So that's another warning for adults. That's the most you have, so be careful. For teens, as their brains are developing and all those cells and neurons are forming together, they haven't made lots of connections yet. There's just a very few connections. And so when you talk to a teen and you try to get them to think rationally or think long term or think, what are all the different elements going on here, it's very hard for them to do it because the neurons are only attached to the ones directly beside. So they can't think, what are the 25-year-long consequences of this behavior? Those neurons aren't connected yet. So when you have those conversations with teens, they're usually much more long and laborious and drawn out as you have to sort of go from A to B to C to D to E. As adults, we're like, don't you know how bad that is for you? You're going to get cirrhosis of the liver and you're going to die when you're 50. And they're like, what? Where are you getting that from? They just don't have that ability to see all those steps down the road. The brain has three main parts. The bottom is the stem. That's where all the main body functions go: heart rate, breathing, all those kinds of things. The midbrain, which is called the limbic system, that has a lot more of the emotions. And then the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, that's all your rational thinking. And the brain forms from the back to the front. So as a child is getting older, you'll see, of course, when a baby is born, that they've got all those basic functions: heartbeat, breathing, blood's going through the body. As they get a bit older, you see some more of those emotions. But the prefrontal cortex, where you do your rational thinking, does not start to develop until about the age of 13. So any kind of rational thinking that you're trying to do with a little child is not working. My kids are 5 and 4, and basically I tell them what to think, I tell them what to do, and they do it because they don't have the ability yet to see what are some of the problems that might occur from my behavior. I have to tell them, that's the problem, stop it. As they get older, of course, when you talk with teenagers, you cannot do that anymore because they simply will not receive that very nicely. The limbic system is the part of the brain that has all the fantastic reward sites that make life exciting, that make life interesting, that make life filled with joy. They're the things that, when you help somebody else, those reward sites are fulfilled and you're excited because you were able to help somebody else. For kids, at the age of 13, those reward sites are just exponentially growing, which is fantastic because they're going to be getting more joy in life. However, that prefrontal cortex of all the rational thinking and long-term thinking has not developed yet. So they go to the instant gratification. Anybody here know teens who plays video games? There you go. That's instant gratification. It's got those reward sites going, saying, hey, this feels good, do more of it, which is great. We want them to learn that life is filled with joy, and there's all these fantastic things you can do that give you that high, that excitement, that joy in life. However, let's not stop at video games. There's many more things that bring so much more joy. Those reward centers, when they're getting fired, it feels good, and you want more of it. And the more you get, the higher it has to go. And you see teens getting into a lot of risk-taking behavior because it's a great way to get that high, to get those reward sites firing for you to say, haha, life is fun, life is exciting. So that risk-taking is very normal in all teens. However, again, because that part of the rational brain has not developed, they haven't yet figured out what are good kind of risks and what are bad kind of risks. They don't know the consequences of what the specific action will give in other than just what's happening right now. If it feels good right now, then you do it. If it doesn't feel good now, don't do it. Don't clean your room. It's not fun. A lot of us actually think that teens don't have any ability to analyze or rationalize or understand that actions could create consequences. And actually, it's quite the opposite, that in a sense, they overanalyze the risk of the immediate, that they are almost their brain is set up in a way that the random bad things of life, that they overanalyze and assume that those random bad things of life will happen to them. I'm sure that there's lots of teens who get into the thought analysis of what, eating healthy or not, certain things working out or not, that they really can figure out some of the consequences of more of the random things that, they think cancer happens, it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. It's true, it could, but they're overanalyzing certain areas. So the question then is, why are they overanalyzing on some things, and yet in that risk-taking behavior, it seems as though they haven't done any analysis. They're going full bore and they don't really care. There's also a part of the brain that develops around starting at about age 13, and it's really big during the years of 13 to 18, and I call it the appearance center. That's the part in the brain that says, I think, and it's true for me at this moment, everybody's looking at me. If you've ever talked to a teen, they think that everybody's always looking at me. No, they're not. But that part of the brain is telling them, yes, they are. People are always looking at you. You're always being criticized by other people. And so if you're not acting right, if you're not saying the right thing, people will pick up on that immediately. They'll know. And that's why if you have a teenage daughter, no offense to any teenage daughters, that they can spend a large amount of time getting ready in the bathroom. They can comb their hair, brush their hair for an hour and a half until every hair is in the perfect spot, because they think if it's not in the perfect spot, somebody's going to notice. I definitely won't notice. Maybe another teen will notice, but I doubt it. But that part of the brain is saying, other teens are watching me and they're going to notice. Absolutely. I think that's also why teens get so embarrassed by their parents, because we don't care. And I can't wait till my kids are teens. I'm sure they'll regret it, but that's another story. So with that onstage mentality, that's where they can get into different kinds of risky behaviors. There was one study that I read. They had 3 groups of kids, 3 groups of people, and they had one group that was teenager ages 15 and 16, one group that was college age 20, 21, and one group that was adults about 30, 32. And they wanted to see, do we all do risk-taking equally? And so what they did was they hooked their brains up to MRI machines to see what's going on in the brain, and the video game that they had to play was a driving video game, and they had to either stop at red lights or blow through yellows if they want. But the more that you go through a yellow light, the increased chance there is that you're going to get into an accident, which will lower your score, of course. And so they had all these groups do it, and they said, it's just you sitting here, do the best you can, do whatever you want. And they all scored about the same. There wasn't any real variance between those 3 groups. Then they retested them again and said, the people that you came with are in the room next door watching your performance. The college-age students, no change. The adults, no change, same score. The kids, perceiving that other people were watching them, their risk-taking behavior doubled. They tried going through the red lights. They got into a lot more crashes, only because they thought their peers were watching them in a video game. Not because they were actually standing there watching them, they just thought they are there. And so a lot of times with our teens, we'll hear them going through some of that thought process of, I don't think I can do that because what will other people think of me? They're not actually there saying, this is what I'm going to think about you if you do that behavior, if you do this, that, or the other thing. But they are thinking, somebody will be watching me at some point, or what will they say when they see this? So there's a lot of perceived pressure as opposed to real, actual pressure. And they will make a decision that we might think is crazy. Why would you blow through all those yellow lights? That risk-taking behavior, that's just terrible. You could hurt yourself. But what's the other side of the risk? The bigger risk is, do I blow through yellow lights, or do I perceive that my friends don't think that I'm cool? The bigger risk is with that appearance center saying, My friends don't think I'm cool. That's the bigger risk at that moment. Long term, of course, that's not the bigger risk, but kids are in that moment, and that is the huge risk. So we see risk-taking behavior more as long-term consequences. They see it as the immediate, what are my peers going to think of this behavior or not? And when you look at it that way, the risk-taking behavior, to some extent, is rational. It makes sense that they're doing some of those things. Teens, as I was reading, I read through one doctor who was talking about the brain and what are perceived risks and not, and knowing that kids know the outcome. And so if we want to give them great lectures about, if you run through yellow lights, this is what's going to happen, they know that. If you ask them when there's no peers around, they have the right answers. They get it. They're not stupid. They know what's going to happen. And the thing that he said that I thought was quite funny is he said, I have never met a pregnant teenage girl that did not know how it biologically transpired. They're smart. They know how it happened. But the immediate risk of saying no to that guy was much higher than the risk of getting pregnant. They get it. They know how that works. They're not stupid that way. Another area that is developing is called the amygdala. The amygdala is a fantastic area in the brain. It's just a fun word as well. The amygdala is the emotional center. For us adults, it's still very active. That's the part of the brain that does, if you've heard of the fight, flight, freeze, if a bear comes into this room, like Garnet just came in, yeah, if a bear comes into this room, we're going to have one of three reactions. We are going to try to fight the bear, we're going to try to run as fast as we can, or there's people that the lights are on but nobody's home. And we will always have one of those reactions. The amygdala releases all the chemicals into the brain that shut down all the rational thinking, because if a bear comes into the room, you really don't care about what you're doing this afternoon, the groceries that you have to pick up on your way home. That doesn't exist because there's a bear right there. And I got to get away from the bear. I'll think about that later. And when all those chemicals are released into the brain, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes until the blood levels start to go back to normal in the amygdala. Another 10 to 15 minutes after that until it's totally relaxed. So when a teen comes home and you say, "How was your day?" "It was terrible. Why would you ask me?" And they run upstairs and slam the door. The last thing that you want to do is to follow them upstairs and say, "What's wrong?" You're going to get more of the same. You're that bear that's coming to attack. So you'll get more anger, more frustration. They're not thinking rationally at that moment. So don't even bother trying. In teens, that amygdala is actually about 2 to 4 times more active than in adults. So anything that for us would carry a little bit of emotional weight, for them it carries a lot of emotional weight. Teens can go from about 20 to 25 different emotional states throughout the day. So they're really angry and the amygdala relaxes, and then they're happy and they're fine and there's no problems, and then they're scared, and it's all over the place, and they're really strong emotions. So for us as adults, when kids are getting upset and fired up about something, for us, we're like, what's the problem? Like, how is that a problem that somebody said they didn't like your shoes? Well, for us, that's maybe like a 1 out of 10 or a 2 out of 10 on importance, but for them, it's a 10 out of 10 because the emotional weight is so huge that they cannot ignore it. So we need to relax ourselves and say, all right, it's the teen brain, it's the amygdala that's firing, let's give it a little bit of time, and then we can do some rational talking about what happened there. And sometimes that conversation can't happen that day. Maybe you have to wait a day, 2 days, a couple of days. But it does, of course, have to happen. So the big piece here is teens do make great decisions, but there has to be no immediate or perceived peer pressure and no emotional pressure. So if you want to have any great talks with your teens or any teens that you're talking to, make sure it's the right environment. If you have a large group of teens, you can expect sort of certain answers because there's that perceived pressure of these are the things that we can talk about, this is the answer I can give, this is the answer I cannot give. And also, again, the emotional pressure, if they're angry, then it's not going to work. You have to wait a little bit. So all of that is kind of the background of what's going on in the brain. So what do we do with this knowledge as we move forward and talk with teens and engage them? I think the most important part is the path that we set for them is the path that's ingrained in their brain long term. We're helping to bake that cake. And Proverbs 22 verse 6 talks about that and says, start your children off on the right path, and then when they're old, they will continue on that path. If we start them off on the wrong path, how can we expect that they can jump over? Or if we don't give them any path, how do we expect them? So we need to challenge them, especially around the ages of 11 to 13 is a real critical period where we want to say, okay, these are the patterns you want for your life. Let's start, even if we talk about Bible study, let's start doing that. And how are we going to do that? And let's develop a way that you can do this for the rest of your life. Prayer, how do you do that? Let's start some kind of pattern so that you can carry it on for the rest of your life. It's just so much easier to do when all of those neural connections are already there in place. It's not impossible to do otherwise, but why not let the brain work for us? To piggyback on that, another portion that really helps to start connecting neurons into that prefrontal cortex is prayer and meditation. There was a study done with nuns, and they were to meditate on one small portion of scripture and just think about it and say it over, and that would be their prayer during the hour that they were in the MRI tube. And they found during that time for nuns, their prefrontal cortex was just lighting up all red because they were engaging that part of the brain. For teens, the more that we can engage that part of the brain, the faster that area of the brain will develop. Self-control is another huge thing that we can help teens to learn. If we go with just more of the instant gratification with those reward sites saying, yeah, video games are the way to go, or the very risk-taking behavior, just do that instant gratification stuff, we're doing them a huge disservice because we are teaching them in their brain, those neural connections are going there saying instant gratification is the way to go. If it doesn't happen in 2 seconds, it's not worth it. So we need to engage them in much more long-term, self-controlled projects. There's a lot of research that says kids who play musical instruments have a lot more self-discipline and do better in life, not because they're musical, but because they learned how to control themselves at that critical time and are able to function better at work, at home, because they don't have that impulse control problem. Another fantastic way is teaching them empathy, to start to think about what do other people think about this and how can we serve other people, and getting them to, because kids are extremely egocentric until about the age of 10. They don't have the ability yet to have any empathy or sympathy of this is what you might be going through. So when they do become teenagers, let's get them involved in activities that are serving other people so that they can understand this empathy and really connect with people. And that dovetails really nicely onto what Mika said earlier. And she also said encouraging discussion. Not lecturing. Lectures are painful for teens. They just shut their brain down and yeah, no, their lights are on but nobody's home. I often will encourage parents of teenagers, if you cannot give the lecture in 7 words or less, do not do it, because you will lose them. And once you get over the 7-word cap, they're gone. Feels good for us when we give a nice crafted lecture, but it really doesn't land at all. So you need to encourage that discussion, that back and forth, thinking with them instead of for them. They need to be firing those neural connections, and the more that they ask questions and we get into those deep dialogues and say, boy, I don't know, what do you think? Let's try to figure this out together. The more that they'll be learning, the more neural connections that will be made. I had a kid about a year ago who was so excited because his catechism teacher said, hey, you want to go out for coffee sometime? And he was like, great, I finally have this connection with somebody, and I'm going to talk to them and open up to them. And the next week when I talked to him and asked how it went, he said, well, It was a fantastic 2 hours of him lecturing me about what I should and should not do and how terrible of a kid I was. So I wish I didn't go. I wish you didn't go either. It didn't help him, and now he just, number one, dislikes that catechism teacher, and number two, dislikes catechism. So we need to think with the kids, to sit in that uncomfortable spot to say, let's try to figure this out. If you are searching and you're in that uncomfortable spot for a long time and they say, what do you think? They're at the point of saying, my brain is ready to receive new information. Whatever lecture you do give will land, will stick. But if they never ask, what do you think? Or don't want that information, they're not at a point ready to listen. Friends, 1 Corinthians 15:33, Paul quotes an old Greek saying that says, you are the friends you keep. And it's extremely true for teens. The peer pressure is huge. So if kids are hanging out with other peers that are drinking all the time and they don't want to lose face, they want to make sure that peers think highly of me, of course they're going to drink, because that's a bigger risk than psoriasis of the liver. Who cares about that? I need these friends to approve of me. So making sure that friends really are helpful, good, positive influences. As adults, I think we need to always make sure that we are attached to kids, that we have that connection, we have that relationship, so that, like Mika was saying, even if they don't necessarily go to parents, that they have other adults in the church that they can have those discussions with. My supervisor at one of my jobs, she says that she always dates her kids, and she has her best friend also dates her kids. They go out on dates. They go out for dinner just to chat. Sometimes it's really deep discussions. Other times it's nothing at all. And they spend 2 hours talking about the sun and how warm it is and the weather. And it takes a lot of time to get to those really good nuggets that you can get to with teens. One more, getting them to think critically, getting them to be able to discern. I had one mother who said, my teen, I don't know where the brain is. I want them to be able to take some information in and figure out, is this good, is this bad, what do I do with it, how does it stand up to Scripture? And this teenage daughter loved Teen Magazine. I've never read it myself. My guess is that it's not so great, but it's Teen Magazine. And so I said, why don't you sit down with her and read some of the articles and teach her, what do you think that they're trying to tell you? What's their agenda? What do they want you to believe? And how does that line up with Scripture? Is it something that we can say, yeah, that's good stuff, you can believe that, or is it something that you run up against Scripture and say, well, they've got their agenda, but it really does not fit at all? So that when teens do move out of the house and they're exposed to anything and everything, that they'll be able to have that discernment, that critical thinking to say, what's their agenda? What's going on here? Is this truth or not? One nice little helpful idea and hint is to control their risky behavior. Let them have risky behavior, let them enjoy those reward centers, but doing it in a controlled way. Sports are a fantastic risk-taking behavior. I know not every kid is sporty. There's lots of other examples, but having it in a controlled environment where if they fail, they won't hurt themselves. If they drink 6 beers and get behind the wheel and they fail, they will be dead. And that one's way too big of a risk. So really controlled things that won't hurt them long term. And if they do get upset, don't take it personally. Let them relax and then have a conversation about what happened and why they had such a strong reaction, and try to get into their shoes, knowing that those emotions are so much bigger for them than it is for us. And one author, one neuroscientist said that teenagers have the passion and the strength, but no brakes. They don't have that critical thinking. They don't have the ability to stop themselves in that moment when the perceived risk of losing teen friends is much bigger than psoriasis of the liver. And we need to help them develop some of those brakes and say, okay, before you start doing some of those things, what are the consequences, so that at least you're starting to form those neural connections. So when they get into that situation, they'll be able to say, I know what I'm supposed to do.